Thank you everyone for joining us for this pre-conference today called Emotions in the Workplace. We are very excited to have Dr. Miriam Madison for this special presentation. As one of Dr. Madison's former MLIS students and academic advisees at Kent State, it is a true privilege to moderate this session today. My name is Kirsten Setzkorn, and I serve as the Humanities Librarian at Cedarville University. As a member of the Cedarville host team this year, it has been a joy to assist with this conference and get to know so many of you better over the past few months. Before we begin the presentation, please note that, like in the first pre-conference, we will have time for question and answers at the end of the presentation. As questions come to mind, you can submit them using the session's Q&A tab in the Whova platform. In the web version, this is located in the right panel to the right of the live stream feed. And in the app, it is located in a button. Also, for more casual conversation, feel free to engage in the chat feature. Now, let me introduce our distinguished guest. Dr. Madison is an associate professor and the doctoral program coordinator at Kent State University School of Information. Her research broadly explores emotion in the workplace. She has studied emotional labor, emotional intelligence, dispositional affect, and interpersonal and emotional soft skills in a variety of library settings. She also researches information literacy instruction and individual differences in students' development of information literacy. She has published in numerous publications, including College and Research Libraries, Library and Information Science Research, Library Management, Library Quarterly, and Portal Libraries in the Academy. She is also the editor of Future Voices and Public Services column in the Public Services Quarterly. Additionally, Miriam is an active speaker at state, national, and international library conferences, including the Ohio Library Council, the Academic Library Association of Ohio, the Association of College and Research Libraries, the American Library Association, and the European Conference on Information Literacy. So without further ado, Dr. Madison, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I hate to have to start a presentation by saying, can you see my slides? But I'm flying blind here because I can't see what you see. So can you just let me know if everything looks good from your end?
Yes, everyone is able to see it.
Awesome, thank you. You'd think after 15 months of living like this, we'd have a better sense of it, and yet here we are. I'd like to start today with an acknowledgement of the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and Wyandot peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Central Ohio, where I am sitting here today, and express gratitude for those whose stewardship and their resilient spirit makes my residence and our residence here possible on this traditional homeland. I'm offering this land acknowledgement today as a reminder of the persistence of colonialism and as a way to encourage all of us to move beyond these words with actions that fully embody a commitment toward dismantling inequality. I also wish to acknowledge the labor that goes into putting on an event like this. There's visible labor, of course, by the planners, and there's also invisible and less visible labor and behind the scenes staff who make this virtual space and these virtual conferences available to all of us, plus all those back in our organizations who are picking up our workload today and in these days so that we can be here. Finally, I'd like to just say that what I'll be talking about today comes from my knowledge in the subject and my interest in the topic, but it's still very much shaped by my own lived experience and the privileges that I benefit from. And I acknowledge and recognize that those privileges are unjustly distributed. So thank you all for being here today for this talk about emotional labor in the workplace. It's such an important topic in librarianship and really in all work because work is saturated with feeling. It really is. And it's funny because I don't think we often really think about it, but we certainly experience it. I mean, think back when you got your bachelor's degree or your master's degree, did you ever really talk about what you might feel in your work? When you interviewed for your position, Did you get asked questions about how do you handle your feelings? Or when you go through a performance appraisal process, are you asked about that? Just a typical day at the office. Do you talk out loud about your feelings or what emotions you might be feeling? It's kind of weird, but we've made affect or emotion or feeling almost undiscussable. Just weird because it's still there. It's definitely there. So I want to start with a bit of a thought exercise. As we go through this session together, if you have some scrap paper handy or you want to pull up a notepad app or something on your phone or on your machine, just jot down all the different emotions that you can remember having felt at work just in the last couple weeks. Don't have to go back too far in time, but just think back and try to capture some of the emotions that you remember feeling. And if you want to get really fancy, you can do 2 columns and you can classify them as emotions that are maybe more positive, emotions that are maybe more negative. Just as I continue to talk, feel free to be capturing those emotions for yourself. It'll be interesting to see. We'll have a chance coming up to share out if you wish to do so. So our roadmap for today then, while you're working on that, is I want to start by talking about how emotions work in our bodies, in our brains and our bodies as a general process. I think, we're not born knowing this stuff, and it's really important background to have so that we can then understand the labor around these emotions. After that, we'll talk about emotional labor, what it is, and what do we know about it. And then in the last third of the talk, I'd like to talk about what we can do about it. Like, what are some things we as individuals can do to help maximize the benefits of emotional labor and minimize the downsides? So we'll get started here. What is emotion anyway? Well, definitionally, it's a reaction to a stimulus with a range of possible consequences, but it doesn't really tell us that much, right? Emotions are typically discrete feelings that can be intense but short-lived. And we contrast that with mood, another emotion-related word, but where emotions are discrete and more intense, moods tend to last a little longer but be more diffuse. We're not always certain what triggered a mood, whereas we can often map back an emotion to something that stimulated it. We contrast mood and emotion with the word affect, which is just a more all-encompassing umbrella term that would include both emotion and mood. So really, at the end of the day, emotions are chemical information and energy. They're chemicals in our brains produced in the hippocampus, released through the pituitary gland, that move through our blood system into all our cells, and they affect every cell. And they're part of our master regulatory system. They help become part of the feedback loop between our bodies and our brains, and between and within people. Our brains monitor this information of how we're feeling in ourselves and in others. And this happens automatically, instantaneously, and continuously. It's an automated process, this feeling and emotion, this chemical signaling, if you will. And of course, it affects how we think and it affects how we act. So it's kind of a big deal. We can think about it as a part of a system of processes that occur chronologically. And again, these are automated systems in our bodies and our brains where they're happening whether we want them to or not, and we're often not fully aware of it. So this slide here is an overview of this emotion process model. And what I want to do is just kind of walk you through each of these just to give you a full understanding of this process. I find it incredibly fascinating, and I think knowing it helps make a whole lot of sense of how we live our lives and go about our days and our jobs, and understanding why we might be feeling what we're feeling. So again, it's a process of super fast, super automated, instantaneous thoughts and feelings that were happening in our brains that we're mostly not conscious of. And it starts with a stimulus. So a stimulus is a salient event or a feature of our environment. And in the workplace, our stimuli are often related to interactions that we have with other people, other coworkers, customers, supervisors, patrons, etc. And the stimulus, in addition to these kind of social interactions or interactions with people, it can also be an event, a condition, a temperature, noise. I put the slide of lavender. It's my favorite scent of all time. And, you know, you can just get a waft of a lavender plant and instantly, you know, a smile crosses your face. You feel this emotional reaction if you love lavender like I do. I also have a little snippet of an email I got last year letting me know I didn't win a big grant. And emails with bad news are also events that can be a stimulus that trigger this emotional response. So there are, you know, hundreds of examples of stimuli in our workplaces, and some of them elicit positive emotions and some of them elicit negative emotions. And they're just always out there, and they're always for us to navigate. And the stimulus is the beginning of this emotions process. Next in the process is this notion of registering the stimulus. So this thing has happened, this event, this smell, this whatever, and we register it through 3 sub-processes, if you will. The first one is just we pay attention to it. Our sensory organs take in the stimulus. We smell it, we see it, we read it, we taste it, whatever. And so the first piece is that we attend to the stimulus, and we may not be conscious of it. You may not know you're smelling lavender until you smell the lavender, but you're smelling all the time. So part 1 of the registration process is just your senses kicking in. The second part of the process is this really cool act of sense making that we do in our brains. And we, once having attended to the stimuli, we ask ourselves a bunch of questions about it. Is it good? Is it bad? Did we like it? Was it in alignment with our goals? Is it an obstacle to our goals? Did we cause it? Did somebody else cause it? Is it certain? Is it uncertain? Is it under my control? Is it not under my control? Researchers differ a little bit on the specificity of these kinds of questions, but they all agree that we go through this sense-making process. We do this appraisal through a schema to ask ourselves, what's happening here? Or what does this mean? And again, this happens automatically, instantaneously, and continuously. You are largely unaware that it's going on. The third piece of this registration process then is that we arrive at an emotion. We've done this sense-making activity, we've asked these questions of ourselves, and depending how we answer those questions, that suggests one particular discrete emotion or another. Further, these decisions that we make about the stimulus, about the event, are very much individual. What we feel, how much we feel of it, and how long we feel it are all really guided by our individual differences. Some people may get some really good news and they just kind of smile slightly. Other people may get that same really good news and they jump up and down and scream and shout, and you know, they're both feeling joy, but one's joy is differently felt than the other. So there's very much a lot of individuality to the feelings rules that we apply as we're understanding our emotions. This model is kind of a helpful way to think about emotions at this holistic level and how we might apply our own feeling rules given a particular situation. Researchers typically use this circumplex model as a useful model to array different emotions on a 2x2 grid here, where the horizontal axis is the pleasantness, the good or badness of the emotion, pleasant to unpleasant. And the vertical axis is the intensity, the activation level. How intense are we feeling that emotion? And so that results in these 4 quadrants, right? You can feel intense positive or intense negative. You can feel mild positive or mild negative. And you can kind of see where different emotion words may fall on such a model. So let's give this a little try here. We've said that we register a stimulus and we apply some sense-making questions to it and apply our own feelings rules and arrive at a particular emotion. So let's try that out. Let's say this is the stimulus that you receive. You learn that a supervisor who is unpleasant to work for leaves your workplace. You're Alfonso in this scenario. A supervisor who is unpleasant to work for is leaving your workplace. You're most likely to feel what? Joy, hope, regret, relief, sadness. I'm not able to see the chat, but if you want to throw in your answer, feel free. I'll give you a second to think about it.
We're getting lots of different comments coming in on the chat, anywhere from relief to saying it depends on who will replace the supervisor, hope, relief, a lot of relief ones. One person said A, B, and D, so a mix of emotions.
Yeah.
But it seems like far and away, relief and hope and joy are kind of the big ones.
Interesting. And you all arrived at that because you were given this really, really tiny fact pattern, right? You got, one sentence about this situation. Obviously, if this is you in a work environment, there's much, much richer contextual information that you would be filtering your appraisal about the particular stimulus of the fact pattern of this supervisor leaving. So that just gives you a glimpse at how differentially we can interpret these same things. How intense you might feel, whether it's positive or negatively valenced, is informed by all these applications of these schema questions and your own sense of what should I be feeling in a situation like this. I will say that these two questions come from a situational test of emotional understanding, where the purpose is to try to measure people's ability to understand emotions. And so these questions were developed through a psychometrically rigorous process and scored by experts, meaning like psychologists and counselors and workplace psychologists and things like that. And given just what you know about this particular question, just this one sentence, which we all agree is insufficient, the right answer as scored by these professionals would be relief, that Alfonso feels relief. But as you all have pointed out in the chat, you might feel something different because there may be some nuances that you're adding to this question that make that emotion be the logical one for you. So the next question, Leah works as a troubleshooter. She's presented with a standard looking problem, but she can't work out how to solve it. Leah is most likely to feel confused, frustrated, surprised, relieved, or distressed. And I'll fast forward, spoiler alert, the experts in this question have scored this as that Leah is most likely to feel frustrated. And I think the reason is because, again, this is a test trying to standardize and measure this. The clue in the fact pattern that they've given you that points toward frustrated is that she is a troubleshooter. Her job is to solve these problems, and she's come across a problem that is standard looking. That suggests this is her job. She's facing something that's very much a part of her job. She should be able to do it. She's unable to do it. That points to frustration. I think a subtle difference between frustration here and confused would be if they had told you she works as a troubleshooter, she's presented with a really unique, novel problem that she's never seen before, and she can't work out how to solve it. In that little twist of the scenario, maybe confused or surprised even might be the resulting emotion that she would feel, because that little twist changes a little bit how she would answer those appraisal questions about certainty, novelty, agency, all these different kinds of schematic questions we might ask of this situation. Isn't it so fascinating how these really interesting and nuanced context clues help point us toward a particular emotion? And you can, of course, see why it gets really messy then, because we don't all see these things in the same way.
I can chime in for a moment too.
Sure.
We're getting some interesting answers in the chats. The consensus definitely seems to be frustrated. Some people saying frustrated leading into distressed because she can't feel like she can solve it,
Sure.
or also some level of excitement in taking on a challenge because she is a problem solver. So really good nuance coming in through the chat answers as well.
Absolutely. That's really great. you you can't help but supply additional context, right? Like that's what's so frustrating about these instruments is you're trying to obviously not have a 3-paged scenario that you want to ask somebody to respond to. So we just naturally begin to supply our own possible additional context clues. Let me not derail us too far and let me jump us back into our model. After we do this registration process and arrive at an emotion and intensity kind of measurement, now we're at the experience of the emotion. And this is really what most of us think about when we think about what is an emotion. It's when we apply, it's the psychological and physiological sense of being affected emotionally by an event. It's the actual feeling of the feel. And of course, there is a wide range of emotions reported in the research that are felt in the workplace. I ask you to jot some down at the very beginning. So if you feel comfortable posting those, maybe you've already done it in the chat, feel free to do that now if you'd like. I'm curious about sort of the range and valence of the emotions. Just to, give you some examples from research, people have reported on the positive side, things like pride, belonging, fulfillment, excitement, optimism, affection, nostalgia. I love nostalgia. Empowerment, joy. On the negative side, I have a whole much longer list, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. We're often more attuned to our negative emotions than our positive ones. Disappointment, fatigue, strain, resentment, anger, embarrassment, disgust, regret, sorrow, fear, desperation, uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty in workplaces, particularly in times of pandemic. And as Kirsten reported, some of you mentioned, of course, there can be more than one emotion at a time, right? As we do that appraisal process, depending on how we answer those questions, it could be yes and rather than an either or kind of answer. So we often feel complex series of emotions or mixed emotions, or just we're ambivalent. We're not really sure how we feel about something. All of these things are options that happen, again, all the time in our workplaces. And how we experience the emotion is, of course, subject to our individual differences. We carry around our own emotional pathways, our emotional grooves, our emotional histories, and those affect how we interpret new stimuli. The more adept we are at interpreting their meaning, sometimes we tend to use these established meanings, these established interpretations that we've already had as the lens through which to interpret new events. It's that whole shortcut zips least effort principle, right? We tend to go to something we know. So for example, somebody who has past emotional experience interpreting and feeling sadness might be more readily able to interpret other events through that lens of sadness too. At some level, the process can become a little bit self-fulfilling. Hilary Elfenbein is an emotion researcher who I appreciate her work, and she's got this great quote: "Everyone can experience every emotion, but practice makes perfect," which kind of gets to that, we sort of get in a groove and can then that be the lens through which we interpret things and thus experience things. But I don't want to at all convey to you that a positive is good and negative is bad and we should all try to be happy, right? That is not what I believe, and I don't think, well, we just won't, I'm not saying that. I want to pause here for a second to talk about the value of all emotions. Again, we said they were energy and information and that convey meaning. And I think anything with information can be beneficial to us, both positive and negative. Positive emotions are just necessary for our daily functioning. They are rewarding, they keep us going, they are the grease that help cooperation happen in workplaces. They can motivate us to be engaged and to stay engaged. They help sustain us, and we persevere through difficult moments because we've got some notion of positive feeling underpinning that. We're more willing to do unpleasant tasks because of the positive emotions we get from doing them. I have often said I could do just about any job, like any task, if I really liked the people with whom I got to do it, you know, that relational piece was so important to me, and that the positivity I got from that could work me through some rather unpleasant tasks. But negative emotions can also be valuable. They're like warnings. They help us galvanize important resources, and they help us direct attention and behaviors towards solving a problem. They raise our awareness of things. They cause us to be able to adapt to our environment. Now, interesting, research has shown that workers' moods have been affected more strongly by negative events than positive events, even though positive events occur more often in the workplace than negative. We tend to recall negative events better. They have a greater impact on us. That list of emotion words I came up with is much longer on the negative side than the positive side, but that just reveals their influence, their information, and their power. So maybe it's helpful to think of negative feelings, and I'm quoting here, like a baby's cry, says Frank McAndrew, who's a psychology professor. It's unpleasant and aversive, but it will motivate you to do something that's good, right? So in essence, you might even be able to get your brain around the notion that negative emotions are really an opportunity. They're not necessarily comfortable. We don't necessarily feel good in the moment, but they are a spotlight and can convey this meaning and convey information and be valuable to us. Having said all that, though, read the red box caveat here. Couple types of negative feelings that don't have that same value. They're sort of considered empty emotions by psychologists: hopelessness, despair, worthlessness. Those emotions tend to signal a level of depression that's worth paying attention to. And if you feel that way, or you know people that feel that way, telling them to just, what can you learn from it, powering through it, not good advice. When you're feeling those, as they say, empty emotions, those feelings that you can't really turn to your advantage, they're conveying something else, something equally important, but something else that needs to be addressed professionally. So I just want to be clear. I'm not speaking a blanket term, beneficial, that all negative emotions are beneficial. Okay, let's get back to our model. So we've got there's been a stimulus, we have registered that, we have experienced the emotion. Now, two things happen. We express the emotion, and then we have some behaviors around the emotion. With the emotional expression piece, we can do that in two ways. We can do that intrapersonally within us, or we can do it interpersonally among people, across people, between people. Intrapersonal emotion, for here we've got the cat looking in the mirror, just examining her own thoughts. I think we've all probably experienced the catharsis that can come from this moment where you're just by yourself and you just let it out, whether it's positive, like, yes, or whether it's, negative or sad or crying or fearful or a shudder or a shock or whatever. But that moment to be like your truly authentic intrapersonal self to yourself can really bring a release. And we can probably think of times where we've done that. Interpersonally, then, emotion is very powerful as a conveyor of information. It's a communication tool, right? It's how we can make how we're feeling known to others. We express ourselves verbally and non-verbally, and it's very powerful on other people. Just think about how you are affected when you are with somebody who is expressing sadness or expressing anger or expressing joy. Imagine that situation and what's happening within you as you are receiving this communication from somebody. So very powerful as a communication tool. And, feelings are linked with these external cues, which are perceived by others, who then try to infer back the emotion that they're seeing from the cue. If you see me come into a room, stomp, 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 and I slam a door, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to deduce that I'm probably frustrated or angry or enraged or something in that more highly activated, negatively valenced anger kind of emotion. It's a form of communication. But one thing to keep in mind is to question whether that communication is always accurate. And the answer is no, it's not always accurate. I can be more or less accurate in expressing what it is I'm feeling. You know, denial is a real thing. I could be denying through my expression what I'm actually feeling. And the person I'm communicating with can be more or less accurate in their interpretation of my expression. Further still, that accuracy can be accidental, like some people just aren't as good as at expressing or interpreting as others, or it can be intentional. People can be purposefully misexpressing or misreading an emotion they're taking in. I know, it's complicated, right? As if this whole thing were complicated enough, this communication piece alone can be fraught with challenges. But interpersonal communication is also a form of social influence. Expressions, how we express our emotions, can trigger responses in other people. You know, if a child who has hurt themselves in a not very serious way, let's say, you know, has this outrageously over the top expression of pain, you know, they're trying to get us to feel sympathy, right? And that's true for a child and an adult for that matter. Emotion expressions can be used as sort of operant conditioning. We're trying to, like, you know, get people to do certain things. In the workplace, for example, a boss can show gratitude for employees who were very cooperative at a certain time, or they can show anger as a way of kind of, like, you know, to sanction or to punish something that they didn't like. Or people can use guilt. I mean, we've all done this with our families, our spouses, our colleagues, use some level of guilt to try to motivate somebody who's not performing in a way that we want them to. So there's that influence piece, that social influence of I'm expressing this to get you to do that. Is this always spontaneous and honest? No, not always. Social factors like the audience around us also informs our emotional expression. Researchers have identified between push factors and pull factors. So push factors are things that are physiological, like breathing heavily, shaking, you know, laughter that you can't suppress, that you just can't stop. You know, some of these physiological expressions, they're without your control. They are accurate expressions of what you're feeling. And we contrast those with pull factors that are informed by or caused by a social intention, where we maybe hold ourselves back or play ourselves up in order to, again, convey information, influence somebody, protect ourselves in some way. So for example, if you feel something like really extreme in the workplace where your physiological symptom or physiological responses might be coming on pretty strong, but you tell yourself, oh, this is inappropriate. I can't act like this in the workplace. And so you you pull it in. You're letting your social environment kind of factor into and maybe even overtake these more spontaneous push factors that you might have been feeling. Just so fascinating how this all comes together in our bodies and our brains. So then the last piece of the model is this notion of behaviors. And again, behaviors comes as the downstream process of the experience. So we experience this emotion and that causes us to express it in some way and also to act on it, to behave in certain ways. And there's a ton of really interesting research around the different kinds of behaviors that tend to co-occur with positive versus negative emotions. So researchers have shown that higher activation negative emotions have the clearest expression signals, the clearest physical expressions, because it's generally biologically adaptive to inform others of these higher stakes, higher valenced emotions. And further, those higher activated negative emotions tend to point towards a specific set of actions. So fear is linked with escape, you know, like that fight or flight sort of, what do I do? I got to get out of here, or I got to fight to the death, right? That comes from an onset of intense fear. Anger is often linked with the desire to attack, to lash out. And disgust, and here's the little girl in the picture, is often linked to the desire to expel, to get rid of. Like you taste something bad, you can't help yourself from spitting it out. So this is really fascinating biologically for our survival. It's just more important to know that somebody's feeling fear or somebody's feeling disgust than it is to know that somebody's feeling bored from being stuck at an airport, right? Thank goodness my teenagers they convey a lot of boredom, but it's not really essential to my survival, fortunately, because I see a lot of boredom. So it's just fascinating, this like link among these negative emotions. In contrast, positive emotions, joy, interest, pride, contentment, love, these lead to a less specific, a less constrained set of responses. So for example, joy has been linked with the urge to play, to be creative. Interest is associated with the desire to take in more information, like to stay engaged, like to keep digging. I think we've all probably felt that time in our lives where we were like just really engaged in something and we just keep going and going. We look up and 5 hours have gone by. Contentment is linked with the desire to appreciate life experiences, to recreate those experiences. I'm a big classical music lover, and you just go into that concert hall and you take in the stimuli of the sounds of the orchestra playing, and you just want to be there and stay in it, and you want to do it again. You're content. Now, having said all this, this is not to say that we are locked into these responses, that we always follow these specific action repertoires, but that our responses tend to come from a narrower set of options when we experience negative emotions, and that positive emotions tend to broaden our thinking and our behavior. They increase the things that we could possibly do as a result of feeling those emotions. Further, positive emotions also can have a longer term effect by helping build up a reservoir or a reserve of positive emotions that we can then tap into under times of duress or difficulty. We call this the broaden and build theory, Fredrickson, broaden and build. And different studies have shown that positive they do these lab settings where they prime positive emotions, and people stay in tasks longer. It has a carryover effect. It carries over into the negative experiences. And so we call it both broadening and building, broadening the range of behaviors and building up this tank, which is kind of a lovely notion, I think, to think about. So I'm going to pause here and let this kind of absorb in with the model back on the screen. And just remind us that this, again, is super fast, it's automatic, it's continuous, it's instantaneous, and all the way from the start of the stimulus to our resulting behaviors, this emotion process is just rich with information and interpretation, and the emotions guide us and help us navigate our world, and especially the human relationships we have within it. And while this process is automatic and continuous, there are ways that we can regulate it and or disrupt it. So, for example, at the front end of the process, going back all the way to the stimulus, we can actually change that, right? We can avoid situations that we expect to be what will be like a negative or an unpleasant situation for us. We can ignore stimuli that we don't want to deal with. I mean, anytime you procrastinate, that you do something you don't want to do, that you avoid somebody that you want to avoid, that you just take a U-turn or something, in some way, we're changing the stimulus. We're choosing, oh, I don't really want to attend to that. Let me go over here. Or in contrast, what do we rush to? What do we turn to? What stimuli are we seeking out? It's kind of an interesting question to pose. Kirsten, let me pause here and see if there's anything from the chat that we want to raise now.
Yeah, the chat has been really active with some really great comments, and I was copying and pasting some of them so I could keep them
Okay.
at hand. One that was just made recently with dealing with, positive versus negative emotions and how we respond and how we process them. One person said that the part of the joy of having positive emotions is not having to do anything about them, which I think ties in really well with what you were saying, with
You
negative
just
emotions being
experience
more
it, right?
expressive.
You just take it in.
Right, right. And there was some really good conversation as well in terms of emotions in the workplace and how that might relate to the context we're in right now with COVID regulations and constantly trying to adapt to new rules, or trying to just put on a happy face or express positive emotions when we're feeling a lot of anxiety or uncertainty with what's going on.
Such a great point. I was in a meeting earlier today where I said out loud, and this is just me speaking personally, we as a society, I do not believe are dealing with this ginormous stimulus of the pandemic and the economic crisis associated with it. These are two hugely powerful stimuli that we have all experienced, and yet a lot of our world is not really facing it. I mean, of course we're facing it. How could we not face it? But are we really letting ourselves process through these processes, doing that registration, that appraisal? What does it really mean? We're all operating under a very powerful stimulus and yet being asked to do heroic things in our jobs and our family lives. And that's going to come out at some point. And I would love it if I were seeing more places where we can collectively process this, and whether that's in the workplace, and it should be the workplace for certain aspects of it, whether it's our hobby life, our church life, our home life. There's a lot that we are facing, and getting comfortable with facing it, I think we will benefit if we can do that. And actually what I'm about to pivot to now, I think could absolutely be applied to processing the pandemic. Yeah. So, okay. So that's our model. This is what I said was automatic, but I also said that we could disrupt it and regulate it. And that is where emotional labor comes in. You wondered, you came to a talk on emotional labor and we're 30 minutes in and we haven't talked about it yet. Emotional labor is, in essence, interrupting this automatic process in one or more places, either in the registration and or the experience and or the expression stage. And so for each one of these phases of the emotion process, there are these opportunities to pause it, to regulate it, and that's where the emotional labor piece comes in. So let's take a little quiz here. I'm going to ask you. I've got a couple slides here with some questions on them. So on that same precious piece of scrap paper that you have, or notepad that you have up, or whatever you're doing, I'm going to read the prompts on the slide, and I'd like to ask you to just mentally think through, or not, write down if you want, whatever you like, how you would respond. So for each statement on this slide, there are two answers you need to think about. How frequently does the statement occur for you, and how long does it last? So the first one, to be effective in my job, I must try to act excited, enthusiastic, proud, or determined. How frequently? For how long? I must act cheerful and sociable. Frequently and long. I must act interested or attentive to another person. And I must make a good impression on others, bosses, coworkers, customers, etc. Okay. Next slide. To be effective at my job, I must try to suppress how upset or distressed I may feel. I must suppress anger and contempt that I may feel. I must try to pretend I'm not upset or distressed. and I must try to pretend I'm not angry or feeling contempt. Okay, so that's one piece of emotional labor, which we'll talk about in just a second. Here's the other piece. More questions. This time there's just one answer, one answer you have to deal with, a frequency. When interacting with others, how often do you do the following behaviors during a typical day? Put on an act in order to deal with customers. Fake a good mood. Put on a show or a performance. Just pretend to have the emotions I need to display for my job. Put on a mask in order to display the emotions I need for the job. And then the last three, how often during a typical workday do you try to actually experience the emotions that you feel you must show? How often do you make an effort to actually feel the emotions you need to display toward others? And how often do you work hard to feel the emotions that I need to show others? Okay, so hold on to those responses for just a moment. And let me talk here a little bit about these definitions of emotional labor. So emotional labor is the notion that you must display a particular emotion or suppress a particular emotion in order to do the job, in order to fill the expectations of the job. So in that case, we're talking about display rules. These rules that describe how you're supposed to feel, how you're supposed to, the emotions you are supposed to express, and we call these display rules. Often in most workplaces, they are express positive and suppress negative. That is most customer-facing retail, sales, restauranting, even in office settings that maybe don't have a public-facing element to them. Mostly the rules are we believe we're supposed to be positive and we're not supposed to be negative. There are some professions where that's not always true. I think of judges, I'm blanking, bill collectors, sometimes police officers. There are some where to do that job, you may need to be a little bit not positive or a little bit more negative. But I think certainly in librarianship, a display rule that we might all say exists in our workplace is to be positive and to try to suppress negative. When that's not always possible, when we're not naturally feeling positive and we can't authentically just be positive, and yet that's the rule that we feel we're supposed to enact, then we do some emotional regulation. We can do one of two things. We can surface act or we can deep act. With surface acting, we're adjusting the outward expression of the emotion expression, but not the felt emotion, not that experiencing, just the expression. It's regulating the emotional expression, and it's a response form of emotional regulation. You're not adjusting anything, you're just slapping on a smile, or maybe you're doing a quick sigh and, you know, a bit of a reset and going on, getting to that positive. We do this by putting on a mask, by suppressing, by amplifying, like ramping up the positive. You know, you think about Disneyland and Disney World and this need to be like over the top joyous. It's the most marvelous place on earth, or you know, the happiest place on earth, right? You can imagine if you're not feeling all that happy, you're gonna have to like amplify it up in order to fulfill the role of that Disney employee. The other regulation strategy that we have is deep acting. And here we're trying to actually change the underlying emotion and thus change the outward expression. So the disruption here aims to change the perception of the situation. So when we do deep acting, when we engage in deep acting, we are doing a reassessment of the situation to try to get to the desired feeling. And research suggests maybe we do this in two ways. One might be to just like go to your happy place. Just think about pleasurable things. You are in a difficult interaction with a patron, but you remember that next week you're going on vacation and you can smell the sea air and something else, so not a separate stimulus, gets you to positive, which gets you through the interaction. Or another option in deep acting is to run through that appraisal process again, to put yourself to reappraising the situation, answering those questions in a different way such that you get to the desired information. I use this a lot with my libraries, public libraries. Frazzled woman comes to the circulation desk screaming about, how do I owe you $75 for this lost book? That's not fair, that's outrageous, blah, 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 blah. Maybe your first reaction is to get defensive and to have a reaction that may not be aligned with what you perceive your display rules are. But in a reappraisal of that situation, maybe you say to yourself, wow, this person has 3 children hanging off her right now. She's probably tired. She's probably got a household full of books. It's probably very easy to lose a book. I can find some compassion for this situation, which will cause me not to feel defensive, but rather to look for a solution forward. And so we can send our brains to do that reappraisal process, deep acting, getting to the desired emotion that we want. The questions that I just asked you were, the first 2 were from an instrument to measure perception of display rules, how much and whether you perceive that there are rules for how you should express your emotions in your workplace. And the second 2 were measures of the degree to which the frequency to which you feel that you need to do surface and deep acting. So higher scores on frequencies and durations of the perception to have these emotional display rules helps you understand whether you perceive there are rules in your organization to express positive and suppress negative. Higher scores means you sense that more. For the second set of questions on the surface and deep acting, questions 1 through 5 were the amount of surface acting, and questions 6 through 8 were the amount of deep acting. I will say, these are not mutually exclusive. People do both all the time. You're constantly negotiating between deep and surface acting. And you know, you can do all kinds of analyses on are there certain situations that send you to surface acting more than deep acting. And some of my research has kind of looked at the times when people were more likely to do one than the other. Interestingly, in librarianship, libraries reported to me that they were way less patient and tolerant of having to do emotional labor when the interaction partner was their colleague. They were way more willing to do it when it was a patron, which is just kind of interesting. Okay, so I'm going to ask if this sounds familiar to you. And maybe you're already doing this, but if you are, if you aren't, if you would like to use the chat to say whether these kinds of things resonate with your work experiences, do you feel you perceive display rules or not? Or are they somewhat more nuanced? Is there a degree to which you feel that you can be more authentic in your reactions at work? I'd love to hear some thoughts that you have going on there, if it sounds at all familiar to you.
There was some chat going on even earlier in your presentation, Dr. Madison, about the emotional labor essentially that public services staff needs to do in library, or library staff librarians who may be dealing with problematic donors and still treating them with kindness and respect, even if their demands might not be reasonable, and dealing with donated materials. So there's been lots of chatter kind of along those lines.
Absolutely. Those are perfect examples of times when we in libraries find ourselves having to do emotional labor. So a question I think it's important to ask ourselves is it doing more harm than good? We know from the research that emotional labor is effortful, and that while surface acting is a kind of a good instinct, you want to try to be positive in the easiest way possible, surface acting is associated with a bunch of negative outcomes for individuals: decreased job satisfaction, emotional exhaustion, cynicism, a lower sense of professional efficacy. So surface acting is pretty universally found to be pretty negative for individuals. Further, people often know you're doing it, right? You can tell when somebody's faking through with an interaction that you're having. And so, people aren't, it doesn't necessarily even can get to the organizational goal it's intended to produce. So it's not always a great strategy, even though it signals the employees kind of trying to do the right thing, but it doesn't tend to lead to good outcomes. Deep acting is a little bit more mixed in the research literature. There could be some positive associations with deep acting, but it's still effortful and it still has some negative associations with cynicism and exhaustion. So it's kind of like less bad, but still not good because it's still effortful. So if doing these things, if we're trying to fulfill these organizational goals, but they're kind of harmful to us, should we even perform emotional labor? I think it's worthwhile asking this question. And, my thoughts on it are really evolving over time. I've been working in this space for, a decade now, and where I might have started out saying, absolutely, we must do it, positivity at all costs. I feel like there's a little bit more nuance there, and that's worth exploring. So I guess I would answer my own question by saying that while the discrepancy that you might feel between these display rules and what you actually feel triggers this regulation process that can be conflictive, right? It can be, there can be a disconnect within us. It takes a toll. It's still worthwhile doing, even even at the cost. And I say that with a giant caveat, because I think there are ways to do it closer to authentic, so that we're not just becoming, emotional robots at the discretion of our employers, but that we're really trying to have successful transactions. We're really just trying to have meaningful, positive relational experiences at work. We're trying to socially influence. We express positivity because we're trying to get something back, that social influence aspect of emotions. We're trying to influence people's behavior in our workplaces. And if we do that with some sincerity, then we should be able to lean towards authenticity in service to the goals of the organization, which we ostensibly believe in, or we aren't working there, right? So when we can make it be relational and we can tie into that broaden and build notion of positive emotions that are not only pleasurable for us, but they trigger these upward spirals leading to future levels of well-being, then trying to get to positive, an honest positive, if you will, seems like it's important as a means to get to that relational, to honor and value the relationships that exist in the workplace with our colleagues, with our patrons, but not to the degree of toxic positivity. I think it's better if we think about developing our emotional muscles, the ability to manage our emotions usefully, positive and negative emotions. And if we can do that, then we minimize the amount of acting, right? We minimize the acting, which is the effortful thing, and we take the information we're getting from our emotions and use it fruitfully, use it productively. So I guess what I'm saying is we can minimize the negative effects of emotional labor if we turn towards maximizing things we can do individually to build ourselves up, to work on those emotional muscles. I often get asked the question, like, what can I do? I'm a manager at a library. What can I do in my organization to help, address this problem with emotional labor? And I actually did some research where I tried to measure the impact of organizational things somebody could do, like create organizational support, autonomy, provide more autonomy to employees, give them better feedback, versus traits that individuals have, people's abilities to process emotions. And while both sets of factors, individual factors and organizational factors, did predict surface acting and deep acting, individual factors were the stronger predictor. So while it is really important to address characteristics of the environment, of the workplace, and in the next couple slides, I want to really look at these individual things that we can work on that help minimize the negative effects of emotional labor. And big piece of that is emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is really just this ability to monitor your own and other people's feelings, to discriminate among feelings, to use the information you get from feelings to inform your thinking and action. It's really just kind of being good at that emotional process, right? The beautiful thing about emotional intelligence is it's an intelligence, it's an ability, which means we can get better at it. It's not just what you're born with. It's not just a trait. It's not just something that's hardwired and difficult to change. It's an accumulation of behaviors and abilities that we can get better at. It's a set of skills that if we put knowledge to and we put practice to, we can actually get better at analyzing and responding to emotionally laden situations. I am incredibly energized by that. I think that's super powerful. We are not victims of our emotions. We can actually kind of lean in and get better at dealing with them. So I'm mindful of the clock and I could spend a whole session on emotional intelligence. So come back next year and we'll do that. But just here's a quick slide of really the predominant model of emotional intelligence that's really held up well, tested now for decades in the literature. And it's the Mayer and Salovey model of the 4 branches of emotional intelligence that are the ability to accurately perceive and express emotions, which is characterized by being able to just identify emotions accurately in yourself and others and discriminating across different emotions. The next branch is the ability to integrate emotions into your thought process. So that's using emotions to direct attention to important information. Like I was saying, using those negative emotions to help you galvanize these resources and solve a problem. It is the ability to encourage multiple emotions and understand how they differentially contribute to understanding and helping you take action and use it to facilitate your thinking. The third branch is understanding emotions, the relationship between emotions and between emotions and circumstances. It's kind of that test that we did back with Alfonso and Leah, being able to map situations to likely emotions and really having a real depth and breadth of understanding. You know, what's the difference between anger and contempt? What's the difference between guilt and shame? There are differences, and being, you know, really literate at those different emotions is what we're talking about here, at understanding emotions. And then managing emotions is that ability to moderate negative and enhance positive emotions, to regulate emotions usefully, to engage with or detach from feelings based on their usefulness, to reflect on emotions and others and process them and interpret them and incorporate them into a repertoire of actions that help you accomplish your goals. The model suggests that we go through these 4 branches kind of in this order, but also so we go down through them as we get better at them, and we also go across them too. So under the first one, perceiving, expressing emotions, you know, there may be like 8 things that go in there, and we work our way across those 8 things also as we're moving down through these 4 branches. So it's not a linear process. It's not, oh, check that off the box. Now I'm emotionally able to perceive and express emotions. I'll move on to the next one. They're very integrated and tangled, but generally we start at the top and work our way down and across through these 4 branches. The benefits of being able to increase your emotional intelligence are many, and this is just a quick list from research literature. They enhance our social relationships, family relationships. There's research that shows better academic achievement, psychological well-being, health. You're perceived more positively by others. I mean, I don't think I need to persuade you of the reasons for trying to improve emotional intelligence, but there is research that shows that it does lead to these really positive outcomes. So I guess I would just ask you to think through this question. If I told you that I could wave a magic wand right now and make you the most emotionally intelligent person ever, like just shoot you right onto the top of the class in emotional intelligence, how would that change things for you? What kinds of things would improve for you? What would your life be like if you felt like you got really good at emotional intelligence, if you practiced and practiced and practiced and developed your emotional intelligence? Just think on that. So this is kind of maybe the most important slide or an important slide. I want to talk about how you can increase your emotional intelligence. And obviously, I mean, this isn't a workshop where we can really practice and do role play and really kind of get into it. But I want to share with you these 4 things that I think are really important things that you can do to begin to sort of build those muscles, those emotional muscles. First, of course, is to begin to pay more attention to your emotions at work. Emotions in your workplace, what you're feeling, what others are feeling. Are you expressing yourself accurately? Get a close person that you can chat with and say, hey, you know, I was really feeling blah, blah, blah. Did that come across? What did you perceive? You know, can you get a partner in the office to have it be a place where you can talk about your emotions and what you're feeling and what you're reading, and check in and see how similar or accurate or shared your discrimination of these different emotions are. Second, can you work on analyzing and employing more emotional knowledge? Analyzing your emotions at a deeper level, asking yourself questions. How are my emotions affecting my thinking and my actions? So if you're frustrated, can you say, wow, I'm feeling frustrated. How did that occur? And like think backward and reverse engineer that appraisal process to see what happened and what conclusions did you reach that led you to feel frustrated? Or can you fast forward? Do you need to convey something that you hope leaves somebody feeling hopeful? What do you need to do? What emotions do you need to summon and convey to help influence somebody to feel that hope that you intend for them? And then also, how are your emotions directing your thinking? Are you saying yes to someone or no to someone because of an emotional reaction? And if so, is that okay? Is that the appropriate answer? Or are your emotions guiding a decision that maybe needs to be unpacked? Third, can you work on developing your ability to effectively express the communication, effectively express the emotion you're feeling? If you're frustrated, instead of it leaking out of you through the slammed door or the footsteps or whatever, or in tone or gesture or writing, can you just say out loud to yourself or to other in the room, wow, I'm really feeling frustrated by this situation. My mentor and person I worked with in my dissertation, Ann Weeks, would say things like, I'm cross. She would say it with this kind of cute little chipmunk face, and it just was so effective because she was feeling cross, but she was able to convey it in such a way that it influenced me to engage with her, not to get defensive or frustrated or scared or any other emotion. It was just such an effective way to convey her feelings. Again, I am not saying that we're trying to force positivity. When there are negative feelings to attend to, by all means, we need to attend to them. But what I am saying is that increasing our emotional intelligence will enable us to be more comfortable with and better at attending to those negative emotions, interpreting them accurately and acting on them in fruitful and productive ways. So I guess my last point there is just make the most of the emotions you're feeling. Use them for the information that they are conveying to you. Let them fill your tank. Let them help you facilitate your creativity, your innovation, your exploration, your engagement, and use the negative emotions as signals of opportunity to make a change for the better. And more importantly, how can you establish work norms and practices for or around using those negative emotions? Do you need a flag? Do you need to like fly, throw a flag like a referee in football? If there's something on the table that's causing a negative reaction, maybe there's something you can do. It's a little gimmicky, I know, but it's a way to make it discussable, to get it to be talked about and to be worked with. How can we extract that useful information? Quickly, I want to just make a very, very important point here that in our workplaces, there are layers that we may not always be aware of. There are additional display rules for different people. And it's super important for those of us who are in the kind of mainstream dominant identity groups, white, female, and libraries, the mainstream, that we may be experiencing things differentially than others who are outside of that norm, outside of that dominant ideological structure. Our workplaces are dominated by these normative ideologies of race and class and gender and ability level. And these ideologies can be and are oppressive systems for people who do not identify with those norms, with that dominant ideology. Beyond outside of the system or being under some amount of oppression by the system, most definitely affects and how we can deliver and the amount of emotional labor we have to deliver. For example, the notion of white institutional presence, which is this notion of whiteness, the superiority of white in our worlds, of this white blindness and white fragility, this norming of white culture, and denying the legitimacy of the racism that inherently exists in most and all walks of our society, can be very difficult for people of color, for non-white people who have to navigate these settings. Think about the emotional labor that you have to perform when you're already in a system of oppression, when you are being microaggressed, when such aggressions, when you bring them to people's attention, are denied and dismissed. Imagine the effort of expressing appropriate emotions when you're being discriminated against. And while at the same time, you're being told, oh no, there's no discrimination here, everyone is equal. Having to tiptoe around in a racialized and microaggressive space requires incredible levels of expressing positive emotion and suppressing negative emotion in ways that are constant and they are exhaustive, and they underpin all the other instances of the other work in the organization that might also require emotional labor. And for many of us, we are unaware of that. That is not something that we typically experience. Negotiating white space while being simultaneously told that white space isn't a thing really requires incredible amounts of emotional labor that many of us do not have to carry out. Or, for example, take ableism, this notion of discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. Robert Wilton published a study that looked at how workers with disabilities have to confront emotional labor requirements differently from others. And he just highlights several of the ways that people with disabilities have to deal with emotional labor. He found, for example, that participants with psychiatric diagnoses like depression and anxiety, that those folks just reported struggling constantly with this expectation of expressing positive emotions in their public facing jobs. Being told, why don't you ever smile? How come you don't smile? I mean, how can you meet a display rule expectation if surface and deep acting are not always possible and not always available to you? Same with physical impairments. How can you express display rules of express positive if you're in physical pain or if your work situations do not accommodate a disability that you might have? It's emotionally laborious to have to negotiate ableist spaces while having to potentially hide a disability for fear of retribution, or while you're managing a visible or an invisible impairment. It requires incredible levels of emotional labor that, again, many of us do not have to carry out and are not aware of. It's really important that we become aware of these hidden depths of emotional labor that exist in our workplaces. So what do we do about that? I think the very first step is to maybe rethink emotional labor in terms of emotional justice in the workplace. And when we can spin it in that way, then I think that leads us to a couple important points. I think that it's important to acknowledge that emotional labor is not one size fits all. Structural forces in and around us require more emotional labor from some than from others, based on our individual differences and our identities. And so thinking that we as are monolithic as a group facing emotional labor would be incorrect, and that we need to be able to understand those forces and those differential applications of emotional labor. I think we need to interrogate by name the display rules in our units. What really are the display rules? Does everybody see them the same way? Are they aligned with our unit goals? Maybe they need to be tweaked. Maybe we need to revisit them. Maybe we need to say them out loud and make sure we all share them or not. Third, we need to ask ourselves, are those display rules being propped up by forces that really, in fact, should be dismantled? Are those display rules such that deep acting is not possible? What do we mean by professionalism? And is it being defined only by a dominant group? Is it taking into account other folks? Interrogating those display rules and what does it mean to require emotional expressions is definitely taking a justice lens towards emotional labor. How can we create new ways of thinking about emotion work based on the ideas of emotional intelligence? How can display rules be reconsidered as interpretive responses where people can be more authentic whenever possible, where our emotional expressions can be more emergent, more meaningful and purposeful, guided again by this relational framework? And then finally, what can we do to be always practicing our emotional intelligence and other soft skills, listening, negotiating, intercultural competencies, problem solving, all of these things that can help make authentic expressions more productive. But then also, when emotional labor is really needed, help steer us and encourage our choosing to do deep acting over surface acting. So this is the last slide. We all do and will continue to feel emotions in the workplace. It's not going away. There's nothing we can do to avoid it, and we really, frankly, don't need to avoid it. Work is saturated with feeling, and I think that's a good thing, and I think we can lean into that and make the most of it. Maybe some of the emotions you listed back at the beginning, you see here on this mood meter, which again is just another image of that circumplex model of high or low activation and high or low degrees of pleasantness. So emotional labor isn't necessarily bad. It isn't inherently bad. Indeed, it's really a meaningful attempt to meet our organizational goals. And while it's not necessarily bad, it is effortful. It is laborious. So by developing our own emotional intelligence, as well as exploring how to approach emotions with greater liberation in our workplaces, in my opinion, these are the keys toward more effective emotional labor, which in the end brings about greater satisfaction in our work and enhances our relationships and our experiences in the workplaces, and it makes our work more meaningful. Thank you all for coming today, and may you find yourself in one of these smiling faces on this slide. I'll be happy to engage in conversation or take your questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Madison, for that excellent presentation and just that encouragement to exercise empathy and sympathy towards one another in the workplace. We have had a very active Q&A panel as well, and lots of questions have been upvoted, which means that our attendees want to give them priority. Okay. So I'm going to start with those and just work our way down the line. So the first one, simple question, but a lot to unpack. What would your advice be to someone who encounters emotionally draining issues at work?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my answer goes to multiple things, right? So, you know, is it on fire? Is it urgent? Is it in your moment and you've got to deal with it now or it gets worse? Or is this like systemic, endemic? Is it something that's it's been there for a while, it's gonna be there for a while, and so it's gonna take longer to deal with? You know, what's the level of gravity and urgency? And being able to kind of parse that and really try to categorize as much as you can and name and interrogate what are the sources of that. Because being able to unpack that, then it informs your thinking and action, right? So then you can say, oh, that's kind of a quick fix. That's just me saying something to so-and-so, or that's me pulling back from something that you don't need to be doing anymore. Whereas if it's something more intense and more deeply entrenched, then maybe you got to raise it up the ladder or bring in some coworkers or take a larger I don't know, more holistic, more complete series of steps for dealing with it. This is all, of course, very abstract, and I apologize for that. The email's now off the screen, but I'm happy to engage further if you wanted to share more specifics. But it seems to me you got to parse it a little bit further too, and find what's solvable in the short term and what will take some more time.
All right, the next question is kind of along the similar lines. Can you speak to the appropriateness of expressing emotions at work? When should we cry or laugh or let people know we are angry as long as we do not harm anyone in the process? We aren't robots, but the interpretation of professionalism can be very fuzzy. Or maybe a better question is, what do we do when we cry or whatever that may be?
Exactly.
It will happen, right?
Necessarily turn it off. So I love this question. I could talk for an hour on this. I know we don't have an hour. I believe we can and should get better at expressing those emotions. Why are we so wigged out about crying? How many times are you in a situation where somebody's going to tear up and they say it out loud? I'm going to tear up. It's like they're embarrassed before it even happens, and they're embarrassed. Why? What's wrong with crying? Crying is not inherently bad. Like, why have we just internalized? Can't cry. If I'm going to cry and then have to feel shame and embarrassment. Why? No. Now, I might be on an island over here with that thought. I don't know that everybody feels that way, but I just like try that on for size. Like, what does that mean? Can you be that way? Can you take that in? And if you can you nudge your coworkers along? Same with anger. Now, do not harm, of course, was a pivotal part of that question. And I definitely feel that way. But again, like Ann Weeks, I'm cross. Like how can we make it okay to say, I'm feeling frustrated by this. I'm feeling anger and surfacing that appraisal. Here's why. I worked really hard on this. I thought I was in control of it and it was taken from me. That's legitimate. You're allowed to feel anger about that. So getting comfortable with the words around it and the tone and the style so that, like I said, it doesn't leak out in a way you don't want, but in a thoughtful, informative way. I may be on an island. I don't want to send you back to your workplaces and say, yeah, go for it, be your authentic selves. But I think societally and in the workplace, we have let ourselves get boxed into a very narrow set of emotions, and we've become afraid of other emotions, and that we don't need to be. And I think we can, again, stretch those muscles, and that's a culture change, which of course are not easy. But find yourself one ally, start testing the waters, see what you can do, and then write me and tell me how it went.
And there was lots of comments in the chat earlier about the value of professional venting, where you can just, in a private, safe setting, share how you're feeling with a coworker or a supervisor and not devolve into gossip or complaining, but just constructive conversation. So yes, there's a lot of people already thinking along these lines.
And there's literature on that co-rumination, you can Google it, co-rumination is different from venting in its kind of intent and purpose. So co-ruminating, where you are conveying a situation in order to get some input, get somebody else's perspective in order to advance a cause or solve a problem. There's like a sincerity thing to that versus I'm mad, I'm gonna be mad. And I'm not saying never vent. I mean, we're human, right? And at some point, the pressure cooker, you just gotta take a little of the pressure off. But the more you can turn venting into co-ruminating, you're solving some problems then, and hopefully you're avoiding something from perpetuating over time is really, I think, the thinking behind it. So yeah, finding that person who will be honest with you and say, you're overreacting, Miriam, or who will say, find the joy in that. Or, again, not with the toxic positivity. It doesn't always have to be happy, 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 but maybe you're missing something because one emotional response is clouding another. So finding that safe other who you can really be with, and then use that as practice towards your emotional intelligence. Get better with your language, get more precise, get more accurate with what you're feeling, why you might be feeling it and what is it pointing you toward in terms of your behaviors and thoughts that you could redirect with a little bit more intention.
Here's another question that I'm sure you've come across many times before. What guidance would you give to those with how to best deal with imposter syndrome?
That's such a good question.
Which is a lot to unpack in the 5 minutes we have remaining, but I'll put that on the table.
You know what? So I have imposter syndrome. I think we all do at different times in our lives. I have it a lot, and I'm 52, and you'd think by now I'd be over it. But at some point, to me, this is how the analogy I'm on. Like I'm on the edge of I'm like on a bridge going over, a cliff, and I either can fall to the right or I can fall to the left. I'm not going to get harmed either way, but I got to kind of like decide. And on the days where I'm like, they're right, I'm a fake, and I fall that way, then that kind of wins. But on the days where I can say, nope, I have done this work. I have put in my thoughts. I have put in my time. I know stuff. I am a legitimate. I can do this. And it's like consciously self-talking myself to go to the right. I don't default to the right. I have to walk myself there during the times that I'm feeling that imposter syndrome. And I'm not always successful, but I believe in the power of that sort of self-narrative, and, find yourself. You can't see it. I've got Post-it notes stuck all over my monitors here with just little things. There's one over here that says reinvent yourself, which is just kind of a reminder to me that like, you're not stuck. You are never stuck with who you are. You can always grow and learn. Growth mindset's a big deal for me. And so can you growth mindset your way out of imposter syndrome on the days that you're feeling it? And I mean, I sound like, oh, it's so easy, just think different, but I know it's not. But give yourself a mantra, a narrative, a phrase, a thought, an analogy, an image, and go back to that. And then just practice it. Just do it. And then let me know how it goes.
Right, that's great. Here's another really good question that's next on the list. Is there any research available about workplace emotion comparisons by profession? If so, what does it say about librarians, and do they give reasons for these? And I know you addressed this briefly kind of in the middle of your presentation there, and I know some of the original workplace emotional labor stuff started with airline stewardesses and things like that.
That's right. There's a lot of empirical research coming from different industries. Hospitality, nursing has a huge literature. Nothing's jumping to my mind, but of course now I'm going to go search for this because I love a good literature search because I am a librarian after all. Something where the purpose of the research is to compare like differentially across professions, I'm not aware, but that would be kind of interesting. Although my hypothesis, I would predict that there might be some specific nuances that our industry tied, that the larger takeaways are more similar than they are different. Teachers, nurses, any of these kind of working with the public. Now, what I think is interesting are, the ones that have looked at cops or judges or some of these where it's not necessarily expressed positive, but suppressed negative, that sort of reverse emotional labor. Those might have some differing effects. And I'm also seeing more and more a movement toward, don't just surface and deep act, really try to get to authenticity. How can you stretch the boundaries of authentic expressions? Because we know those are more healthy for us. So that's some really interesting space on, if we didn't have to act, we wouldn't be emotionally laboring, right? We would just be being. And so, I'm not sure what my next research projects are going to be in this space, but I'm kind of really fascinated by that authentic question and what might that look like? And I just can't help but tie it to emotional intelligence. But anyway, yeah. So let's go dig in the literature and see what we can find.
Well, we're almost at the top of the hour here, so I might pose a question to April and say if we want to stay on, or if Dr. Madison, if you have some more time, answer a few more questions, or if not, we can go ahead and end this.
Want to, whatever you all want to do. I don't have anywhere else to be.
Okay. Okay, well, if that's the case, then I'll go ahead and ask the next question. If people need to leave the session, they're welcome to do that.
Absolutely.
But I think this will be a really good one, especially towards what you were speaking at towards the end of your presentation, Miriam, which is how can we educate our employers or HR about these cultural differences, disability differences, so that expectations aren't so unrealistic, aren't so one size fits all.
Pat, I mean, that's the $50 billion question, right? It's one thing for us to know it in our minds and our hearts, but to change a system is really what this question is asking. The Pollyanna in me really really would love to see that this coming out of the pandemic as an opportunity to rethink a lot of things about our workplaces. We've all been so totally, I mean, I'm in my basement. I have been in my basement for the last 15 months. It's an opportunity for workplaces to question a lot of stuff they thought to be true. They thought to be, you know, just the way it has to be. I have seen more people report that having to work virtually has helped their ability to do their job because of their disabilities, whether they be physical, mental, visible or invisible, that being able to work from home made some aspect of their job significantly better and easier, made them better able to do their jobs. I would just hate if we lost that. So I'm wondering if we can't use the cover of the pandemic as a legitimate world shared experience to question some of these things that we just wouldn't have been brave enough or would have been just too wacky to question prior to. It's shaken so much loose that maybe we can use that to say, hey, since we've already proven that we can work pretty effectively from home, maybe we want to work differently, and how could we do that? Now, I say that most of us work in libraries. Libraries tend to be situated in large organizations where we have very little sway and influence over HR policy. In my own environment, I'm trying to say with Kent State, like as we're thinking about going back, you know, I don't want to throw out what the benefits we gained from this model going forward, as it might relate to emotions. So even I'm thinking about, do I put together like a little allied group? Do I find some people who think similarly to me, who we might be able to like write a talking points document or get a meeting with somebody at HR? You know, what are some steps we can take to influence and question and open the discussion for some of these things? You'll of course hit bureaucracy along the way, but can you find a key leader, you know, a higher up or somebody, an insider, get their ear, get an advocate, get a champion. And the other thing is I am seeing this more outside of libraries. I'm seeing other types of organizations be way more nimble at adjusting to these things. And libraries tend to be more conservative in innovation. We are not radical innovators, we're more incremental innovators. And it may be that we need the other industries to kind of go out and change some things in the nature of work, and we'll trail along in a year or two also. I mean, that would not surprise me if that's kind of how it played out. But that doesn't mean we need to like not even be pushing and raising issues even now. And again, I think the cover, if you will, of the pandemic is a beautiful reason to start asking some of these questions.
Thank you so much for the answer. I'm being reminded that we have some other events going on this evening, and to be fair to the prior speakers, we should wrap things up. But thank you so much for being so generous with your time, Dr. Madison, and with your presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees who've been so active in the chat and the Q&A panels. You guys make these really fun sessions to moderate. So thank you again, Dr. Madison.
It's my pleasure. Thank you to you all. Have a great rest of your conference.
Thank you.